So, refresher, quant data, it is numbers. It's hard data, which you get statistics from. It provides us summary data. We understand the response range, generally through questionnaires and surveys. So it's through closed questions. Yes, no responses, ranking responses, so we put scales or agree, disagree. All right, so we understand that. It's, in terms of the mechanics of the manipulation of the data, it's probably the easiest to do. It's also the easiest to get wrong, because if your numbers don't add up, there'll always be somebody that's sitting in your presentation and say, your numbers don't add up. And then you've got to justify it on a flat. So always check, double check it. Don't rely on it. It's really challenging in a consultation in the analysis phase because we always do it under time pressure. We've always got to get it out for the meeting of, it's got to go through lots of governance stages. And there is a pushback around that, in that Gunning 3 and Gunning 4, I mean, there is a potential interpretation of Gunning 3 which is about allowing sufficient time for consideration. So the argument for that is that you should always allow the consultation to be live for enough time for respondents, for your consultees, to have a look at the information, to ensure that they've had the time to get it into their understanding, to have asked the questions and absorb the information, to then be able to respond. But there's also, it's not been tested in law, but there's also an implicit, or an implication rather, that actually if we're giving that time to the consultees to respond, we should give a corresponding consideration to the amount of time which we should provide for the analysis, so that the time that's taken for it. Which leads us on to Gunning 4, which is conscientious consideration. So if we haven't allowed enough time to do this, and how are we going to be absolutely confident that we can provide to decision makers the evidence which allows them to make conscientious consideration of all the outputs of the consultation? Now, if you look at Cabinet Office's government's guidance on analysis, they specify a 12-week period for analysis. We're never going to get that. It's, it's just that government does what government does, and in fairness, we're talking about massive programs, national scale, all of that, national, sometimes international scale, so therefore massive complexities. We've got massive complexities, but we've also got other operational pressures, and we have to fit within governance cycles. But just ensure that you do make sure that governance cycles are you going into the appropriate governance cycle. Don't go for, just think, can we push it out to the next one? But that involves ensuring that decision makers know and are comfortable with it. Okay, so essentially the extreme example, the daft example I always give is, if you've had a consultation out for 12 weeks and you're going to say, I'm going to have the report done by the end of the week after closure, are you doing justice to the time that everybody's put in to provide that input? Is that fair to your consultees? And are you going to be confident that when your consultor, your decision makers, the fire authority, the individuals who make the final decision on that, when they're accountable under Gunning 4, are you confident that you've given all of that information to give them that? So there's loads of challenges. That's why data analysis for consultation and engagement has loads of nuances and layers that we have to think about as we're going through. And as seasoned practitioners, you'll know one of the things that we'll always do is we'll put together our pre-consultation engagement plan, we'll put our engagement plan. And what we always forget, and this is a generalisation, so it might not apply to you, but what we always forget is the analysis plan. Putting together the time that we're going to take to do this. So all of this stuff that we've built up now, and all of the data and data analysis, if we haven't thought about the time it's going to take us, again, we're going to hit short. Repeating myself now, but I think it's an important message to rehearse. So how do we do it? How do we do quantitative analysis? So the first thing is that we relate measurement scales with the variables. This sounds such an obvious point, but we need to think about what we're measuring. If it's a yes/no question, we set up our analysis as a binary choice. So we're looking at, is it yes or no? There should be a tertiary choice in that, which is don't know, or rather not answer, rather not respond. But primarily it's a binary choice, yes or no. If we've got a Likert scale, we'll look at the ways in which we put those into place. So we'd look at what ranks as 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. So that's strongly disagree to strongly agree, or whatever scale that you choose to use, whether it's a 10 for granularity. Doesn't add that much to the analysis. I prefer to use a 5-point scale. But anyway, look at that, associate with them, and decide what your measurement scales are. So put your arranged data in the proper order. And part of that is just making sure that you've split responses from question 1 from responses from question 2. It's not quite as easy to do as you can do in qualitative data, but we have seen instances where people have put data sets in the same field and started to try and do analysis on the same thing. And it's particularly misleading if you've got, say, question 4 is how strongly do we agree with this proposition? And question 5 is how strongly do you agree? So if you put question 5 and 6 together, you get completely misleading results. So just make sure it's split out. Generally, the software does it for you, but always just check. The first thing you do is a visual check. Just make sure the headers are all in place and they are in the order that you'd expect them to be. The data makes sense, okay? The raw data makes sense. So then you need to link descriptive statistics to the data. What do we mean by that? So we need to look at what scale have we chosen. So is it a nominal scale? So is it the naming around? So have we assigned data to names, values to names, or have we used a interval or ratio scale? Have we looked at so nominal is associated with nouns. So when we say that, it's the name. So we assign a value to a name. So if, for instance, are you from the local community, or are you representing local community? Are you representing the businesses? What's that? So that's a nominal scale. So it's nouns. Ordinal is ranking and order data. So it doesn't provide you with an interval. So we just kind of set the ranking. Intervals is where we set up a Likert scale or an NPS scale, Net Promoter Score scale. So we say, ask you 1 to 5, 1 to 10, what you're doing, so how we rate that. And ratios is where we assign something to a set of data. Age group is the usual one that we'd use to describe what a ratio is. So we work all those through, put those into place. Then we start to link those descriptive stats to the data, work out how are you going to measure it? Are you going to measure the mean, the median, the mode, the frequency, the min-max, percentages? What's the important data in this? For consultation and engagement, generally we're looking at the percentages response rates. So it's how people are likely to respond. So we're working on that. You can do all of that other stuff, but there are 2 points to that. One, what value does it add to the analysis, to the decision makers when you provide that analysis? So the mean of this, or the median, or the mode of this, what added value it might do, but you need to think about that, what your decision maker is going to look at it. And the other point is, it's making a lot more work for you under time pressures.
Is that where you would need your rationale as to why you've chosen that particular way? Because people might say, well, you've just manipulated the data to say something that you want to say by using, say, median rather than mode.
Yeah, that's why it is really, once you start getting into more complex statistical presentations, you do have to have more of a rationale for it. Yeah. If we're just doing I say straight, advisedly, if we're just saying the percentage of people that respond to this, the number and percentage, it's a clearer cut presentation. There's less implications of that you're trying to introduce a bias into it.
There's nothing to stop you, I suppose, when you're doing reporting, either presenting for decision or later use of the data, to say this was the percentage but this was the mean, and if you look at the mean it helps us decide that, this, that and the other.
Exactly. However, for reporting, for consultation, there's a big danger in that. And the thing is that you over-report your quantitative data and under-report your qual, because you get quant's dead easy to report. You get your table, you get your data, it just chunks out, so you can get your pie chart, you can do, and it looks to the uninformed reader and sometimes the decision makers, it looks like the quantitative data is more important.
It's suggestive, doesn't it?
Yeah,
Almost in itself.
It does. Yeah. So you can do all of that stuff, but what I would always recommend is that you present the bare minimum quant data in your main report. If you want to do all the fancy stuff, present it as a statistical analysis, statistical appendices, so that if somebody's interested in it, they can go and dig into that, so they can look at that. But if you're going to do mean, median, mode, you've got to explain, as Paquita says, what it means, what the differences is, what the limitations are. Dave pointed out that if you look at some data cuts, you don't get this full spread of the data. You're just picking out the middle bit out of it, which is, for something that's as an engineer, I want to know what the middle of it is, but as a consultation and engagement professional, I want to know what the spread is. So it's different ways of looking at it. So we need to think about that as well.
How important is it to engage with the decision makers about them before you actually draft your plan? Because you can, again, be interpreting their need for information from where we sit, but they're on a different mountain than we are. We're down in the valley somewhere, and they missed the valley bits, and we're responsible for giving them the valley information. But then they're looking at something different. So is there an element that we might miss in our planning that's not giving them the level of information that they need, or in the way that they need?
Absolutely. So the analysis plan should always involve the decision makers. You should always be talking to them to find out what is the key data that you want around this. There's another principle that applies in terms of any consultation and engagement, which is a pyramid or a triangle of information. So when you're presenting any form of information, right the way from when you do your consultation documents to when you do your analysis report, the argument is that you should provide the simplest level of information, so your executive summary. So any report you provide, any decision-making report, should have an executive summary, as good practice dictates. Then you provide the detail in that, which it will be the summary detail. And then for those people who are interested in it, you provide a separate statistical annex, which goes right into the detail around that. So if people want to probe into it, or you signpost to where, if they're really interested, where the data set resides. So if you want to go and interrogate this, you'll find it on that partition on the corporate servers. whatever. Maybe not that far, but you provide that information. But that applies right the way across the consultation and engagement period. You always provide minimum information, if you like, the easy read version of it, which is probably not quite the right description, but anyway, in terms of the appropriateness of it, because it's got separate needs. But you've got your easy read, executive summary, detail, then granular detail that sits beneath it. And that still applies for that. So, but there's two things that you need to be clear with your decision makers. What's the minimum level of information that you want, and what's the maximum level of information that you want? And how do you want this presented? And you also need to make it clear to them that sometimes you haven't got time to write a short report. So that is, if you want us to do that, you need to think about where it sits in your governance cycle. Okay. When you're reporting, you need to decide what your measurement scale is, what you're going to put, how you're going to put it into it. So what you're reporting on. Okay. So it should reflect the scales that you used beforehand, but you need to be clear as well, because the kind of the standard way of reporting is to pull together agree and strongly disagree. Agree and strongly agree, and disagree and strongly disagree, to bring those together. And the reason for doing that is to overcome that extreme reporting that we talked about. So we treat them as one category. You allow respondents to put it so that they feel that response, and you should be able to disaggregate it if questioned. But it goes some way to counter that when people extreme score. I'm going to strongly agree, I'm going to strongly disagree. Bring it all together. So report around that. So make sure that your measurement scales are appropriate, and explain why you've done it, if necessary. Or be prepared to explain why you've done it, okay, as you're going through that. Create data tables. Create appropriate data tables, because you can do all sorts. You can end up with over analysis paralysis. It's the term that my business studies lecturer used to talk to me about, and all that kind of stuff. We all remember it, don't we? But just being over-faced with data, and we get it all the time, presenting us all of this information. As analysts, when we get all of those tables, the first thing is you're thinking, you go bog-eyed, don't you? What am I going to do with this? So what you're doing, what your purpose is to simplify it down to a point where it's meaningful. You haven't simplified it too much, and you can do that. And then create the data tables and chart. Charting is, in my opinion, the devil's tool. It's too easy to do. It looks great, doesn't it? You know, we present pie charts, scatter charts, spider diagrams. Look great. They draw their eye to them. It makes data look more important than it is. So chart it, but only chart where it's appropriate and where it adds value. The data analysis is relatively straightforward. The data presentation for consultation engagement is where the biggest issues lie. So this is pretty much standard. Some of the tools that can help with you can use Excel. Excel's pretty good. It's getting better all the time. I once had somebody send to all people, copy everyone in, a very strong argument to say we shouldn't use SPSS, or actually it was a different system we were using, because Excel did it all, and we could do it all in pivot tables. And we had to have a little conversation about the sensible use of copy everyone in, and also maybe let's think about when we're making software recommendations, how we do that. But Excel is really powerful. Okay, if you've got other software, you can use Access. For very small data, it's very useful. gives some more flexibility that Excel necessarily doesn't have in terms of presentation. But having said that, things like pivot tables, Power Pivots, and Power BI, the overlays that go onto Excel provide a lot more information. Power BI helps you build dashboards as you're going through. Really powerful demonstration tool. Access does all that sort of stuff, but it's limited by the amount of data, as is Excel. But then you get into specialist tools. SPSS is the most commonly recognised, the kind of the academic standard. But then there are other tools that are used. We used to use things like Confirm It and other big platforms, but there are available.